You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hello, I'm Chris Coyne, the Associate Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at George Mason University, and I am joined today by my colleague, Pete Boettke, who is the Director of the F.A. Hayek Program and is also a Distinguished University Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Pete, good to talk to you as always. Thanks for spending time with me.
Oh, Chris, this is going to be awesome.
All right. So what we are talking about today is the economist Kenneth Boulding. And our goal here is to provide listeners with an overview of Boulding's life with an emphasis on your personal relationship with him as a student teacher, and we'll come to that in a moment. But I also really want to touch upon as we go along this to touch upon the connection with what you've called mainline economics, and then also various opportunities for building on Boulding's work in light of mainline economics and what we do here in the Hayek program. And so to kick this off, let me ask you to say some words about your personal interactions with Boulding as a student here at GMU. So give us a time frame, give us the context of your interactions, and then some impressions of those interactions you had with him, both in the classroom but outside the classroom. Because hearing some of the stories from you, I know there's some great stuff.
Yeah, so Professor Boulding was a Robinson professor. There's something funky about it because they don't list him under the Robinson professors, but that's how he was introduced to all of us at the time. So I think maybe he was a visiting Robinson professor and never went through the whole like appointment kind of idea. But the Robinson professors at that time were the most distinguished professors on the campus at George Mason. And I started graduate school in 1984, and I think it's accurate to say that he came in 19 spent the 1986-87 academic year. I believe that that is correct. I should back up for a second. When I was an undergraduate at the school that I went to, we had to take a year-long history of economic thought. And so when I came to that was how they taught economics. It wasn't like just a requirement. It actually was the way they taught economics was in the history of ideas kind of approach. And so when I came to George Mason, I wanted to take history of thought right away because that was a major thing. And Boulding had written this fantastic paper called "After Samuelson, Who Needs Smith." And it was in Hope, so it was in the top journal in the field of history economic thought, and I had been exposed to it as an undergraduate, but I really got into it when I was a first year graduate student, and my friend Dave Perchico as well, because I was telling him all about it and everything, and then, he was interested, and Dave was very interested in peace studies, is the other issue. So when we heard that Boulding was coming to campus, I guess we were in our 3rd year, we were just elated because, now we're gonna have this, from Dave's point of view, you have this great champion of peace studies, and you have this great contra Whig historian of economic thought. And so we like the economics and the sociology department in Robinson were right next to each other. They were on one wing and then the next wing. And Boulding's office was in the sociology department because that's where the conflict resolution people were located at that time. That's what he came here as, a Robinson professor of conflict resolution. And so I think it probably before he even like got in his office, Dave and I were like parked outside and we explained who we were and everything like that. And he was like the sweetest man in the world and just, adopted us kind of as his students. And we spent a lot of time talking to him outside of class. We attended his classes. But more memorable things was sitting with him outside of class and learning from him and talking to him, including going to over to they had him in an apartment, townhouse on 123 over here, and go and talk to him. So we just, you know, just spent an inordinate amount of time. I was taking a class with Buchanan at the same time, and both him and Buchanan spent a serious amount of time on Adam Smith's deer and beaver model. And I remember going up to him and saying, Mr. Boulding, he required you to call him Mr. Boulding. I said, Mr. Boulding, I said, I have Buchanan's class and we're doing deer and beaver model. And I said, and in your class, we're doing the deer and beaver model over and over again. And I said, what's with that? And he said, oh, he says that's just in his characteristic way. I'm not going to imitate him. But he says, oh, dear Peter, he goes, that's just the tradition of Frank Knight. Frank Knight only talked about two things: the deer and beaver model or world religion. That was it. And so anyway, just to get a sense, he was this the way he taught. I took a course with him called Great Books in Economics. We read in that class The Wealth of Nations, David Ricardo, Marx, and Keynes. Okay. So this is what we read. We spent most of the class on Smith, though, I will tell you. And what I remember the most is Smith and Keynes. I don't really remember as much the way he talked about Ricardo and Marx all that much. But Smith and Keynes, and he would sit with the copy of his book, torn copies of his book, cross his legs and like read a passage and then invite discussion, and it was like amazing. And so to this day, when I read The Wealth of Nations, I still hear Kenneth Boulding when I read certain passages. It's like the way I understand it. But it was during the heyday of Reagan and Star Wars and some of those kind of things that was going on. And so he would tell us stories about the early days and whatnot, but also express his concerns with increasing militarization, because he would talk to us a lot about what he and Elsa, his wife, did in the '60s to help with draft dodgers and other people when they were in Colorado. And he kidded around with us. He said that he always had a penchant to tell Pacheco and I, see, he always had a penchant for protecting anarchists while we were sitting with him. And so that was kind of, he kind of was cute. Anyway, he was a professor's professor.
That's a great context, and we're going to touch upon some of the points you raised about his work, and as we move through a broad timeline in a few minutes. But the idea of mainline economics, this is an idea that you've been discussing for a long time, since I was a student here with you back in the early 2000s. But you've really kind of delved in more detail in your book Living Economics, in your other writings, and it's foundational to what we do here at the Hayek program. And how do you see Boulding fitting in with your conception of mainline economics? So I guess the question for you is number one, briefly explain in a line or two how you envision mainline economics for listeners who may not be familiar. And then number two, how do you see Boulding fitting into that?
It's kind of a complicated question at some level, but an easy question at another. The terminology comes from Bolden. And you also have to keep in mind that right from the beginning, I was really enamored with Buchanan's essay, What Should Economists Do? In many ways, that's kind of an urtext in my educational career. So these two pieces, Buchanan's What Should Economists Do? And Boulding's After Samuelson, Who Needs Smith. And in both cases, what they kind of argue is, as you know from the Buchanan piece, it's the men who sit in the seat of Adam Smith that are worthy of our attention. So it's this Smithian economics that, what is the core propositions of the economics of Adam Smith that have continued through the ages? Because the argument that Boulding makes is that after Samuelson, who needs Smith? We all do, because Smith is still part of our extended present. Smith's evolutionary potential as a scientist hasn't been exhausted yet. And so the main line is, what are those substantive propositions that we get from Smith and how can we work on those? Now, the context of the propositions, Boulding was not as evident a contributor to, though I twist him to be one, but he's not as evident in his work to be a contributor to, as you would say Smith, Menger, and Hayek. And the way I view the main line is that it's you square the rational choice postulate with the invisible hand, or you derive the invisible hand proposition from the rational choice postulate, but via institutions. And so, therefore, your focus of analytical attention is on the institutional framework within which exchange takes place. And so, man has a natural propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, but the way we engage in those exchanges is going to be a function of the institutions within which we operate. Okay. And so that's who I would see as the main idea of Adam Smith and David Hume that then gets translated into John Baptiste Say. Note I didn't say Ricardo. I said Say, right? Parts of Mill, but then eventually Menger and then Mises and Hayek and whatnot. And then today, Buchanan and other people that have emphasized this, that it's about economics is about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. And I want to contrast that with mainstream economics, which is whatever is currently fashionable in the science at the moment. So at sometimes the main line is the mainstream. At other times, the mainstream deviates significantly from the main line, and I try to use that as a wedge to explain schools of economic thought within the orthodoxy of economics. Meaning, they're trying to explain the regulatory, self-regulating aspects of a market, and so you get property rights economics. Well, why did we need property rights economics? Well, because you know Aristotle criticized Plato for, so we didn't need to have Armin Alchin rediscover property rights, but somehow we did, because economics had lost its way. The fact of that the political processes matter in the way in which we didn't need to have Gordon Tullock tell us about rent seeking. Bastiat already told us about the petition to the, from the candlestick makers to the government to protect them from the competition of the sun, right? And so these various schools of thought, one of which is being the entrepreneur and the Austrian market process theory, as Smith referred to it, the higgling and bargaining of the market. Well, that's what Kersner is talking about in terms of the alert and creative entrepreneur. So anyway, now Boulding gives us that language, but if you actually read him closely, he actually also gives you the propositions. He's just not associated with it. Part of that is because he was very favorable to Keynes. All right. And so you associate that with the breakdown of the self-regulating aspects of the market. And he did think that the market had problems with inequality, right? That's why he cared about Keynes, Koletsky, and Kenneth. That's how he used to put it in class. The three Ks, the special K factor: Keynes, Koletsky, and Kenneth. And he was an evolutionary theory. So he saw a lot of dynamism and flux in the economic process. So the economic process wasn't stasis for him. It was a dynamic, fluid process. But if you look at his book, Toward a Reconstruction of Economics, it actually requires us to think about the balance sheet approach. And to do that, you have to have institutions. This is the Mises argument in the calculation debate. It's just at the flip side of what it is that goes on under markets, which is you have to have the institutions of property, contract, and consent to be able to engage in cost accounting. If you don't have those, you can't engage. So you can back out the kind of concerns that I have with mainline economics into Boulding, but he never really stressed them in the same way that, say, Menger or Hayek did, right? So there's no quote that you can find, I think, in Boulding that says, that the most important questions are about undesigned order or whatever. However, and this is the last thing I'll say, I know I'm giving you a long winded answer. He was a founding member of the general systems theory. He cared about like what we now call complex adaptive systems. So he wasn't trying to develop the general competitive equilibrium and the first and second welfare theorems. That's not how he thought about the world. He thought about the world more in this evolutionary biological kind of process. He's in that regard, he's similar to Lynn Ostrom in that his main metaphors come out of biology, not out of physics, which I'll say is fascinating. The last thing I'll say is because in his own biography, he started out as a chemist. That's what he wanted to study. And then he switched to the social sciences. but he started out studying chemistry, and chemistry would be closer in a science to, even though it's a experimental science, it's closer to physics than it is, I think, to biology. But he, I think it's because he was concerned with ecological issues that biology became a major way in which he wanted to talk about economic processes.
Yeah, that's great, and we're gonna come to that in a moment, his background, and, the other thing that's unique about Boulding is the way which I'll briefly say this and get your reaction to it on the mainline point. The way he approached the study of the social sciences as a human science, you always point out how thinkers like Ostrom's, Buchanan, they don't give up the rational choice postulate, but it's the choosing as if the chooser is a human. And in his American economic address when he was the president, economics is a moral science. He has this great line in there where he differentiates. He calls it the economic ethic, which is like the hardcore rational choice postulate, and the heroic ethic. The heroic ethic is I can identify with other human beings. And he goes to make the point. He goes, no one in their right mind would ever want their daughter to marry economic man. But he says we also don't want to give up that people make choices. They choose according to costs and benefits, but they also take into account other people. They have empathy, they have compassion, and they can think of other people. And so he's kind of chiding his fellow economists for neglecting those important aspects. But just to step back now, and we're going to touch upon several of the points you brought up. Let's kind of go back to the beginning and give the listeners a sense of what's going on here. So I'll start off and you just jump in when you want, or I'll stop and ask you questions. 1910 is when Boulding is born in Liverpool, England. He won a scholarship, as you mentioned, to study chemistry at New College, Oxford, and he started there in 1928. But if I remember correctly, he came under the influence of Lionel Robbins, I believe, who had played a big role in him shifting into the equivalent of what we would call PPE now, an interdisciplinary type study. The other big thing I just want to highlight that happens at during his time at Oxford is he is influenced by the Religious Society of Friends, Quakerism, and he would eventually become a Quaker, and admittedly, in his own words, that influenced him enormously in how he thought about matters of peace, war, and so on. And we can come back and talk about that a little more later on. But the other interesting thing that happens is he starts writing economics papers. And of course, he also saw Keynes present when he was at Oxford, which was the first time I think he interacted with him and became an admirer of him. And you mentioned that a moment ago. Now, if I understand correctly, he published a paper. So it's 1928 to 1931 is when he's at Oxford. He graduates with honors. A year later, he publishes a paper in Keynes's journal, the Economic Journal, on the place of the concept of displacement costs. So this is pretty crazy, right? You have someone who just graduated, the equivalent of undergraduate, publishing a paper in the Economics Journal. That led for him to come to America. So he gets a fellowship in 1932 to go to the University of Chicago. So here is where he's studying with Frank Knight, who you mentioned a moment ago, Jacob Viner, and others. He is there for 2 years and decides not to finish his PhD. So he heads back to Britain and takes up a lecturer position. And he's there until 1937. But from that 34 to 37 period, Frank Knight publishes a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics with Mr. Bolding. See, everyone called him Mr. Bolding, with Mr. Bolding in the title. The Theory of Investment, once more, Mr. Bolding and the Austrians. And somewhere I remember reading that Bolding joked, who needs a PhD when you when you have Frank Knight writing an article about you in the QJ. That kind of set the stage for him to really ramp up his academic career. So he never finished his PhD formally, but he came back to the United States and in 1937 got a job at Colgate University. That was his first job. While he's there, so he's there from 37 to 1941, he published his book Economic Analysis. He married his wife, who you mentioned earlier. And then he starts to move around actually quite a bit. This is the other really fascinating thing about his career. I don't know if you have any thoughts along the way, but he jumped around quite a bit. And when he left Colgate, he moved to the League of Nations Economics and Financial Division at Princeton University, and he was only there for a year because he and his wife wrote a pamphlet. It's like a memo that was unpublished called a call to disarm, which was a call for pacifism in the wake of what was happening in the world in the early 1940s. And he got forced out. And from what I've read, they said, look, if you circulate this memo, you're out. They circulated it, and he was forced out, which speaks to the kind of courage of his convictions when it comes to matters of war and pacifism. From there, he goes to Fisk University. So imagine not having an academic job, and he has to take a position at Fisk University, which is one of the historically black colleges. He's only there for a year, and then he moves to Iowa State College, from there to McGill University. So again, he's jumping around quite a bit at this time, 2 to 3 year stints at these places. And then in 1949 is when he moves to Michigan. And that was one of his two main university affiliations towards the end of on the back end of his career. And of course, during that same year in 1949 is when he wins the John Bates Clark Medal, and that is a major award given out by the American Economic Association for the economist under 40 who has made significant contributions.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's great. I think that listeners might be a little confused about the Robbins thing, but that's actually a true issue is that Robbins was at Oxford in the late 20s before he was tapped to become the department chairman at the university, at London School of Economics, because Alwyn Young passed away. So it was like a very, the person that they brought in to be the department chairman at the LSE died of influenza. And so then they had a very short time period and they scooped up Lionel Robbins, who was a graduate, but a very, well established young people knew who he was. But he was only, I think, 31 years old, maybe, or even in his late 20s when they gave him that job. So it was amazing, opportunity. These kind of things about Oxford or Cambridge and the tutors are kind of interesting because Amartya Sen's tutor in Cambridge, besides Joan Robinson, was actually P.T. Bauer. And so, he acknowledges the fact that P.T. Bauer. So there's these kind of ideas, and it makes sense because later on, Sen is sometimes often sensitive to the kind of concerns that a Bauer would raise. I'm not saying he's a protege of P.T. Bauer, but he's sensitive to some of those concerns that Bauer would raise, which means why he's open to Buchanan and stuff in a way that, say, Arrow never was, right? In a kind of interesting aspect. I think that Boulding's decision, twofold decision, right? So the first one is that in the middle of what was going on in the 1930s and 1940s, he stuck to his guns about not about pacifism. And I think that besides the Princeton example, that in those times was a very unpopular position to hold, and he stuck to his guns on that one. And I think he was to some extent paid a price for that. But also, and this is a more methodological issue, is in 49 when Samuelson's Foundations comes out, or was it 47? When Samuelson's Foundation comes out, he writes a very long review in the Journal of Political Economy, which gets published as a kind of an essay on the role of mathematics and economics. And he's highly critical, and he argues that the flawless precision of mathematical economics will prove to be less effective than work that's done at the literary borderland of economics and sociology. And so he kind of placed a bet on his position. And, in many ways, he lost that bet at the time. But, just to go back to something you said about his presidential address, And this notion that we do rational choice as if the choosers are human, and institutional analysis as if history matters. I think that it's important, and I know that you've quoted this as well, but Boulding tries to argue that this very fascinating thing. He says trying to do economics without or social science without the backbone of the structure of the rational choice model is like an amorphous jellyfish, right? So he doesn't want you to live in that literary borderland and deny economics. But the problem is that if you just do the economics, all you have is the skeleton. All right. And so he wanted to kind of find that sweet, spot where you both have the structure of economic argumentation, but you're taking into account all these other factors, like to use the metaphor, you're not an amorphous jellyfish, but instead a functioning, strong arm that requires ligaments and muscles and everything else, as well as your bones and joints to work. And so again, he gets that metaphor from Knight, I would argue, and he plays that up. But in his time, that was misunderstood by both sides in some sense. And so again, he was a lone wolf in many ways because he didn't really have, even though he won the Clark Medal, which is a significant medal, for scientific achievement, and his textbook was widely used. It got supplanted eventually by Samuelson's textbook, but it was a widely used textbook up to that point. And it's more micro based than macro based, even though it's Keynes, but it's micro based. It builds up from the individual to the collective rather than starting with the collective or whatever. He's an enigma because he is both an iconoclast and therefore on his own, but yet he's also so professionally connected. So, he's president of the AEA, he's president of this society, he's president of that. He founded a field in conflict and defense, and as I said, he was a founding member of the General Systems, Society, and Bertalanffy and all these other, complex adaptive model type people. So there's just a very, very rich, intellectual history that you have there.
Yeah, I put together a list of his professional associations where he was the president. This is president, so it's not just membership. Society for General Systems Research, that's what you were mentioning. AEA, that's the American Economic Association. International Peace Research Society, Association for the Study of the Grants Economy, International Studies Association, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the section on economics of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. So, busy man giving presidential addresses.
Yeah.
Uh, it's to your point, he certainly was well known, but he also had his feet and arms and everything else in different ponds, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, I think he didn't think that economics is best left, to its in isolation. It needed to constantly be, by the way, I just wanted to point out to people because they might not know, Boulding always used to make fun of the notion of what they called New College, because it's actually the original, like, so it goes all the way back in time, and he always said, like, "Oh, I went to New College, but it wasn't so new."
All right, so we're in Michigan. I want to touch upon a couple of things at Michigan that happened, and he stays at Michigan until 1949 is when he gets there, and he's there until 1967 when he moves to Boulder, Colorado, University of Colorado. That was his final professional move, which we'll come back to later. But it's at Michigan in 1956 he publishes his book The Image, and he considered this to be one of, if not his most important and influential book. He dictated it in, I think, 2 weeks. And so it reads as in a very conversational way, even though it's dealing with knowledge, the nature of knowledge, the sociology of knowledge, and so on. But Boulding there is talking about how, among other things, how behavior is primarily shaped by one's internal, what he calls image or knowledge stock of the world. And one of the things that he emphasizes in there is that the individual, as he puts it in his own words, is the ultimate owner of their image. So he's pushing back against some form of behavioralism where it's purely external stimuli that determine what we do. He's not denying that information, or what he calls messages in the book, hit us from the day we're born, as he says. And but the individual ultimately has agency for filtering out, for sorting through and selecting those pieces of information that they want to adapt and reject. The question I want to ask you is your general thoughts on that book, but also perhaps the connection with Hayek on things like the facts of the social science, because we see here with Boulding, he's really, this is not his terminology, but he's saying, look, in order to understand phenomena, we have to understand how people view those phenomena, and people's view of the world is filtered through the human mind. So everything starts with humans, their purposes, their plans, their images. So, any thoughts on that book at all?
Yeah, so I'm gonna, address the book directly, but I wanna sort of say something background, which is, you mentioned that Knight titled his essay on the theory of Mr. Boulding and the theory of investment and, the Austrians once more, right? Because he was dealing with that. Because, Boulding actually had a lot of affinity with Austrian ideas. When I mentioned earlier that people misunderstood because he was a pacifist during the war, and so one of the things that people thought was that and he also was favorable to Keynes, so they kind of thought of him as a person on the left. And so left wing groups, when he told Perjico and I a story, he said a left wing group hired him when Hayek did his tour of the United States for the Road to Serfdom. And so he was supposed to go to the town right after, Hayek gave his talk, and he was supposed to then, disabuse them of the Hayekian bad influence or whatever. And he got fired after the third day because the group found out that he was agreeing with Hayek. And so they're like, okay, and if you look, and this is relevant to the image, if you look, he has commentaries on Lockman and Shackle that are sprinkled throughout his various different, writings. And so he was very aware of other people that were thinking along these lines about that the economic phenomena or social life is always filtered through the human mind. And that's in some sense the fundamental idea of the image. The background of the image is quite fascinating. Dave Pacheco and I, have that book because of Boulding, telling us about it, and I believe that he gave us copies of it, but my memory might be wrong on that. But it's quite interesting because he told us that he was giving us advice as young academics, and he said you can either write books or read books. And then he gave us the story of his year at the Center for Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences, which he said he spent the entire year quieting his mind, enjoying the seminars, reading all the different things, everything like that. And then he was getting to the end of his period and he said, "Oh, I'm supposed to produce something." And so he sat down and produced the image, and if you go, it's a weird book in the sense that he starts by looking out the window, right? He's looking out the window and he goes all the way around the world kind of thing. And and all this different stuff. It's so, but your summary is a great summary, I think, because what he is doing there again is that the human science, you said this earlier, in the human sciences, unless the humans are at the core of it, you miss the point. And if you have humans at the core of it, you have to remember that everything is filtered through the human perception and possibilities and imagination that they have. And so, like Shackle, Boulding in many ways is perhaps the theorist of economics that most wanted to bring imagination and choice at the center stage of our idea. And so, this in your own work, this becomes an important idea because you have to imagine the possibilities of peaceableness. And as you know, he tried to always boil it down to little like proof of concept things, which is that if it's already happening, then we may be able to scale it, right? So he's never pointing out peaceableness strategies that we don't already see working. somewhere, but it's usually at a smaller scale. But you have to imagine that. And if you don't imagine that, you lack that imagination of that possibility, you're not going to see it. And that has influenced a lot of the way that I think about, like, kind of even the most radical positions that I hold, which is that I can soften to potential listeners the radicalness of it, because I'm not really saying that that's the only way that you could do it. It's that, can't you imagine this possibility? Like, how would that work? To most people, a lot of the things that I think, it would be a nightmare to them, right? Like, so if we say about COVID, could you imagine a world where we didn't have mandates and instead we had to do this? And they're thinking like, it's like patients, whatever, like the movies or whatever, the
28 days later or something, yeah.
yeah, 28 days later or something. And in my mind, it's like, if you remember in the beginning of the COVID, that couple that fell in love across and they got the bubble things to go have, that's how I'm thinking about all kinds of entrepreneurial solutions to this without having the mandates that people would be able to solve problems. And so rather than 28 days, you have, unfortunately, people bouncing into each other with bubbles or whatever. But it's a kind of this issue that he lays out in that book is at the core of what it is that our enterprise is about, if we put ourselves in the model. So we don't stand outside, but we recognize that we have to do economics or social science from the inside out. We have to begin with the people who populate the world that we're studying, the creativity, resourcefulness, and cleverness of those people. And that starts with their ability to imagine alternative possibilities.
Yeah, and that idea permeates much of his work, as you touched upon, outside of some narrow conception of economics, which he talks about in the book. And so just to give listeners a timeline where we are, 1949, he moves to Michigan. As Pete mentioned, right before well, I guess while he's there, he's working on the image at the end, but he was at Stanford for a year, 1954 to 1955. That's the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences that Pete mentioned. And then at the tail end of that is when he records or dictates the image, which came out in 1956. And then he goes back to Michigan. And the other amazing thing about Boulding, when you read about his life, is he like pivots very quickly between major projects. So he spends a year at Stanford. He writes the image. He comes back 1957. He co-founds the Journal of Conflict Resolution, which is one of the leading journals in international relations to this day. 2 years later, he co-founded the Center for Research on Conflict Resolution at the University of Michigan. During that time, so we're talking here late 50s into the early 60s, he works on his book on defense, conflict and defense, a general theory. Again, he was taking another leave when he worked on that. He took a lot of leaves during his career because he was constantly traveling and interacting with these different audiences.
I think this is if I could just say, that's a kind of an intriguing thing with him, because I don't think you can find like a legions of students that work with him. I mean, you have people that are influenced, but you don't have like a Boulding school that he nurtured and whatnot. You have Boulding works that he nurtured and developed. But if that makes any sense. I mean, I haven't checked the numbers, but I don't think he was like the dissertation advisor in the same way that Jim Buchanan was a dissertation advisor of, 40 or 50 people that Buchanan, supervised over the years, and sort of led to this kind of revolution of public choice thinking as they themselves had successful careers. I think he was very much in this regard like Thomas Schelling, and they were both, developing that idea. And when Schelling retired from Harvard, I remember, Solo gave a kind of a snarky remark at the retirement dinner where he referred to Schelling as, living off his wits, right? Rather than the rest of us who live, through our proofs and everything like that. He lived off his wits. I think probably people thought that Boulding was similar in that sense. He lived off his wits, but he took on, the two of them took on, the biggest hairy problem of their age, and they both were very rigorous in their approach to it. Boulding was actually quite proud of the technical analysis in conflict and defense. In that, I mean, he was, basically, if you look at it, he's taking Stackelberg, equations and then applying them to resolute conflict resolution kind of ideas. So he had great technical skills. He just didn't think the technique should trump the analysis, if that makes any sense. And so you should choose those tools and techniques which are appropriate to the task that you're trying to address. But yeah, you're right. I mean, he jumped, and he also was always taught. So, for example, institutionalists, very much appreciated him because he wrote about evolutionary economics. But his evolutionary economics like nodded to maybe to Veblen, but it wasn't the same kind of evolutionary economics as Veblen, right? It was something different, and so he was always like at the edge, but also something different on these things. So it makes him fascinating to study. And again, in your area that you work in, not only the conflict and defense, obviously, but the stable peace and other ones, but also his book on power, where he's trying to bring power into economics or to social science, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll Three Faces of Power is that book. We'll come back to that in a little bit since that comes out later. Actually, he used that to teach one of the classes he taught here at Mason, where we started our discussion. The other just thing I wanted to highlight in passing that before we move on from Michigan, his time at University of Michigan is in the mid '60s, so 1965. He was very active in on campus in terms of organizing the anti-war protests related to Vietnam. And so University of Michigan, there was, I don't know if it's well known, but there was a teach-in, on campus where they had speakers and debates and discussion about the war. It was like, I don't remember if it was half a day or a full day, but in any case, Boulding was, prominent in organizing that and getting people to attend and, as speakers and speaking himself. So again, you see this thread where I remember reading somewhere that he said, I live, my life has been living an uncomfortable edge between science and religion, and he always had his personal views and this back and forth. And one thing I do appreciate about him, people can knock him for this, I guess, if they want, but he was very always open about his normative convictions. And as he mentions in his AEA address, economists at some point adopt normative positions, and they should be open about that. And Buchanan is another person that I always appreciate that he recognized this, and Sen too. Sen talks about this in places, so it's an important point I think to at least appreciate. In 1967, the Bouldings moved from Michigan to University of Colorado. And that's where he spent the remainder of his career. A year after arriving in 1968 is when he is the president of the AEA, and that's the Economics as a Moral Science. That's the title of his address that I was mentioning before. And the gist of that, if memory serves me, is the point I just raised that economists invoke normative assumptions, certainly when it comes to policy, but even more broadly, the very endeavor of engaging in a social science or any science that requires one to adopt certain values about how you do the science, how you interact with other people in the scientific endeavor, and so on. So there's kind of like a meta point about what it means to be a scientist, and then within that, it's like how do you do economics? I don't think Boulding, I don't know this for sure, but I don't think he would have rejected the fact that there is a positive science of economics. I think what he would have said, similar to how I read Buchanan, is look, for a lot of the issues that we're concerned about, especially with things like applied issues, welfare economics, and so on, let's not pretend that you can bring the positive analysis of the blackboard and just plop it down onto the world and not invoke any kind of normative standards, any kind of values, ethical judgments, and so on.
I think Boulding might be a little better than Buchanan on this issue because Buchanan was somewhat schizophrenic, right? If men are like rats, then we can use Homo economicus. If men aren't like rats, then what? It's almost like philosophical reflections, right? Rather than And I think Boulding thought that there was a way to square that circle, that you're never homo economicus, but yet you're also never not a conscious chooser that is weighing alternatives, right? This goes back to your point about the image. The image is driven by the idea that individuals imagine alternative courses of actions. And the reason why they choose course of action A versus course of action B can be described as, pursuing the marginal benefits that are greater than the marginal costs, right, of each one of those things. And so there to Boulding, there was never, I don't think, a domain of economics which was just strictly speaking max use subject to constraints. But Buchanan did think that there was that to the extent that we were acting like rats, then you can do that to the extent that we're not acting like rats. And so, it's he always Buchanan was always caught between what he called predictive science and economics as philosophy. And I think Boulding just sort of was in the middle ground, like the way Kerzner is, or Hayek is, or someone else, which is and Buchanan, to be honest with you, practiced in that middle ground as opposed to this. But in his rhetoric, sometimes he would say this. But I think Boulding sort of carved out a way in which economics was done. It goes back to the mainline thing. It's the way economics was done by Adam Smith, right? There is an analytical Adam Smith and there is a moral philosopher, Adam Smith, and you can't really distinguish between the two of them. His moral philosophy is informed by his analytics, and his analytical tools are deployed to address the moral questions that he cares about. And that comes up in the Power book, right? Because it's his version of like Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. It's like his version of that at some level, and yet again, it's analytical all the way through, but the context changes in the way in which the analysis plays out.
That's exactly right.
Can I say something about Colorado
No, oh,
though?
yeah, yeah.
Because
Go ahead.
that's where he told Perchico and I he would protect the anarchists, that he and Elsa would protect. But first, it just was draft dodgers, right, who were trying to escape, from the draft. And so when he went to Colorado, that's more up in the mountains or whatever. It's more remote, and which, by the way, again, think about that. Michigan, Iowa State is still in the was always known for theory. So there's a reason why you're at Iowa State. Michigan, of course, is one of the top at that time, probably either number 2 or number 3 public university in the United States. Berkeley, right? And then maybe Michigan probably after that. But Colorado, that's like, that's a move similar to Buchanan moving to George Mason University, right? It's kind of an unusual school for a heavy hitter of the status of Boulding to be at, but I think it reflects, Boulding's, lone wolf kind of idea. Anyway, and the reason why he came to George Mason is because Colorado had a mandatory retirement. And so he was forced into retirement, and so then he, like, lived an academic vagabond life, and Elsa would go one place, and he would go another place, and then they would meet up, and then they go another place, and this and that, they had 5 kids, and then they had a bunch of grandkids as well, and, he just was like, wonderful family-oriented person, which is also really important, in my own life because my main professors in graduate school, not Don Lavoie, but Buchanan and Tulloch, had no kids. It seemed like their only life was their work, right? And so Boulding had like he was a genius, but he also had like a family with kids and grandkids and all the stuff that goes with it. So it was like, oh, proof of concept. You can do that. You don't have to, yeah.
Yeah, the proof of concept thing, I never met him, but he strikes me as such a charming, funny person because he refers to it as Boulding's first law constantly, and he says,
Yeah.
"If something exists, it's possible," which
Yeah.
is hilarious, but it's also, like, common sense, but it's a interesting way to think because it doesn't it's not that he's insane, so he doesn't think, like, small things happen between you and I, and therefore world peace. But it does emphasize the fact that it's possible. So he has these great, like, one-off lines where he'll say things like, "Look, I get into an argument with someone at dinner, I don't spit in their face or, like, stab them with my butter knife. Therefore, people can disagree and not kill each other or violently harm each other. If I can do that with a stranger, why can't two world leaders do that? Because he's working in the context of the kind of view that, especially in the international realm, kind of conflict is an inevitability. Violence, I shouldn't say conflict, that violence to resort resolve conflict is almost inevitable. And the natural response to that is kind of an arms race, right? This is the time he's dealing with these issues. You need it's peace through strength. So you need to have a bigger and bigger butter knife to stab the other person. But his point is when you normalize the butter knife, even if it's for deterrence purposes, it increases the chance. And this is the image point. You start to view the other party as someone you need to force in order to get the outcome you want.
You can't see the possibilities of any of the win-win situations because it's just gonna be a zero-sum game. I either lose or I win in the conflict, right? And so I might as well have, the biggest gun to take to the table. Otherwise, I'm gonna lose, and, yeah, so, again, Boulding is he had a great way with words, and he was very charming in the way he deployed those words and to make his point, so he was gifted in that regard.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to this point you've raised about the Three Faces of Power, which is a later book. I want to mention because we're in my brief timeline here. We're in Colorado, and as you mentioned, he had a he had a forced retirement in 1980. So he had to depart. So 1967 to 1980, he's at Colorado. One of the things he does there, I want to highlight two pieces of writing he does there. One is the stable piece, which you and I were just talking about indirectly. That's 1978. But in 1969, he writes this pamphlet on what he calls the grants economy. And the grants economy for Boulding is this idea of one-way transfers. It's rather than an exchange like we think about in a market, it is the transfer from one person to another. And then from there, he differentiates between in that initial pamphlet or monograph. It's a short monograph. He differentiates between two forms of grants. What he calls benevolence-based grants. That's things like charity, philanthropy. He talks about the importance of love, altruism, empathy. That's our ability as human beings to connect with other human beings and then to transfer things to them without any expectation of, well, good for service or good for good of any kind. But then he also talks about what he calls threat-based grants. That's things like taxation, theft. So that's a one-way transfer, but at the point of a gun. I raise this both because in his mind, and he talks about this. This was crucial for him to understand social interactions, and he constantly chides economists, including people, by the way, like Milton Friedman, who I think he was sympathetic towards generally, because he says their arguments about liberalism are too narrowly economic focused. So he says that people like Milton Friedman overemphasize the importance of the purely economic gains from freedom of exchange, which he fully recognizes are important. But what he thinks that neglects is this human element, the benevolence-based grants, what Deirdre McCloskey, I guess, more recently would call like sweet talk, the stuff that makes us human beings. This is interesting in of itself, but it also serves as the foundation for the Three Faces of Power. Because in the Three Faces of Power, which is published after he leaves Colorado, I think it's 1989 is when that comes out. Three Faces of Power. Balding describes power as getting someone to do what you want. And he says there's multiple ways to do it. He calls them organizers. So the one organizer is exchange. I can get you to do what I want by trading with you. I'll give you a cup of coffee and you give me $3. I can get you to do what I want you to do through force. So I can stick a gun in your face, or he calls it a threat system. I can threaten you. You'll do what you'll do what I want because there will be a penalty imposed upon you if you don't. Or the third is what he now calls in this book an integrative system. The integrative system is the love, the altruism, and it doesn't necessarily have to be one way systems. He talks. I think he has an example in there about back massage. Like, oh, you give your spouse a back massage, your spouse gives you one because you care about each other, not because you expect any kind of payment of money, not because you say, give me a back massage or I'll divorce you. So there's no threat system. And Boulding's point there, it's interesting because it's a comparative institutional analysis in that book of studying those different type of systems. Because he goes through, okay, let's think about these three organizers in different settings: government, markets, civil society, or internal to organizations. And so it's an interesting taxonomy for doing comparative institutional analysis, but it then opens the door to having a richer understanding of social life outside of just kind of a simple state market dichotomy, but while also recognizing those possibilities.
I think it's great summary. By the way, Mansur Olson, when Boulding passed away, described Boulding as the mix between Milton Friedman and Mahatma Gandhi. So that sort of, is an interesting way to think about it. I do, I think that your timeline is right. I think that he was a Robinson visiting professor twice, 86 to 87, and then I believe 89 to 90 is the second time that he was that. I was gone at that time.
Gone for the second one, the 89-90, right?
Yeah, yeah, I was already teaching at, I was teaching at Oakland University and moving to New York University, but it was reading that discussion, by the way, of the back massage that made me think about one of the examples I always used to use to talk about credible, commitments, which is, in my book, Why Perestroika Failed, I try to make a deal out of that about how you have to do this because unless it's out of the kindness of your heart, you have a commitment issue that's involved in that. And so that was a little economistic back reading into Boulding's idea. But I do think one way to think about Boulding is to think about him in the same way we think about Albert Hirschman, right? A person who was extremely gifted with the pen and extremely wide ranging in the way that they thought about the world and tried to write in a way that was across disciplines. So it's not that he dumbed down what he wrote. It's so he wasn't a popularizer. He was an interdisciplinary scholar. So he wrote in a way to try to minimize the jargon of technical economics while retaining the analytical structure of economics to be able to talk to political scientists, to sociologists, to historians. And a lot of this is because he cared so much about the peace studies, and so he was trying to actually talk in that world of all of these different people. And I think Hirschman's a similar way. He's writing across disciplines, not necessarily down to, oh, could I get it so a high school kid could understand what I'm saying? It's more, can I get it so that every one of these people in these different disciplines at the university can understand the point that I'm trying to make. But what it made them both do is have these like categorizations about the relationship to highlight various aspects of it so that you could go like it could click, you know? And so this integrative system that you're talking about, that is like that's one of those areas where you click and see. And again, it's an appeal to your everyday existence. So it goes back all the way to his sort of way in which you were talking in the beginning about the way in which he would understand who was the individual in economics, right? It's not just a character in a model. It's the neighbor that's living next door to you. Oh, can I say one other thing? One of my favorite you were talking about the grants economy. Boulding, his collected works are huge. It's like I think it's 4 volumes and all these papers, and that was done way before he retired when they did the collected works. But there's an essay in there on the waste of intellectual resources. And I think one of the things that's fascinating about Boulding is he didn't see the world as necessarily just, smooth and continuous and twice differentiable, right? So it was lumpy and had all kinds of problems that you had to deal with. And so he saw that in even in intellectual affairs, you could have waste that was introduced because of fads and fashion and science. And so I think this is like his way of reconciling the fact that he could make progress in his own head, but not yet see the progress in the profession. because the profession had maybe gone in this direction and that direction, and the self-correction in the intellectual marketplace is not as quick and as efficient, let's say, as the intellectual. I might be reading into that now, but as quick as and efficient as it might be in the marketplace. But it's a very, very useful essay that explains his contra Whig position. Because the Whig position is that whatever comes after is better than what came before. And the whole point, going back to the mainline stuff in Boulding's essay on Smith, is that we haven't yet beat Adam Smith on certain margins. So that's why we got to go back to Adam Smith, because he still has more wisdom and knowledge than we have after all these years. And Buchanan used to put this challenge to us too. He'd say in class, he goes, "What more do we know about markets today than what Adam Smith knew in 1776? And if we don't have an obvious answer to that, perhaps the emperor has no clothes." And make us think it's like an untimely question, because you're in the middle of your PhD studies and you think you're at the outer edge of the science. And then you have these old established, superstars, but are iconoclastic. And they're sitting there saying to you, think twice, young man. It might not be as obvious to you that the world today, what you're learning, the literature you're reading today in the AER is better than what you could have read in 1945. It might be that it's worse because we got misdirected. And so, read widely, think critically, learn to write with clarity. That was their kind of message.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing about Boulding, which I'll just mention, when you were talking about his writing and accessibility, he also had, which I know you know, but he had I don't know if it was a hobby. He wrote a lot of them, but poems and sonnets. He published multiple books on sonnets.
Books, ballots, and Boldingisms.
Yeah, that's an edited volume where it has like collections of his.
Also, drawings.
Yes, these drawings, which are absurd, I should say. It looks like I have it. It looks like a 5-year-old did it. It's like the inflation monster, and it looks like, but then it's like a poem underneath it.
Yeah, so when Pacheco and I were studying with him, he had us go over to his home, and he had up on his refrigerator pinned watercolors of downtown Fairfax. Now, Chris and I live in the Fairfax area. Fairfax is 10 times more attractive today than it was back in the mid 80s. And it was like, what are you doing? You're like taking pictures of like a building that, and he was not taking pictures, drawing them and watercolors. And they were like, no offense, but these would be like Cornelius, things. And he took such pride in them. And I remember that it was just so like awesome. And this is what's in the book. When you look at the book, you're like, what the hell? He's got doodles and stuff. And so, but and yeah, he published those Beast Ballots and Boldingism.
Yeah, it's awesome. But he also just you can, listeners can go read some of this stuff online. In the 1950s, he had this poem, The Busted Thermostat, where he's talking about King Whoopla. And King Whoopla, there's unemployment because he says markets aren't self-correcting. So then he starts inflating. And then he, like, in this little poem, he talks about King Whoopla screwing things up because he's, trying to cure unemployment, but results in, inflation and all these distortionary effects. So it's really amazing stuff.
He introduced Mach-Up, I think, at the AEA meetings at one time, and they have it down. He goes, Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3, Mach-Up.
See, he's funny. He must have been funny to interact with, I think.
He was a sheer joy to interact with.
Yeah, I'm sure it sounds like it.
And to see him interact also with Buchanan and Tulloch was quite fascinating, because Tulloch wanted to always push his buttons about war and and all these things like that, like nuclear things. You got to remember, I was in graduate school with the Reagan years, right? And then there was the episode of Reagan being caught on the hot mic, where he was telling he was unleashing the bombs or whatever. And so, there was all this kind of Tulloch was, we should be, first strike people or whatever kind of thing. But the issue with Buchanan, and it's not that Buchanan didn't respect other people. That's a totally wrong way to put it. He had tremendous respect for other thinkers, but he had a certain reverence for Knight, and Boulding because of, I think, the association of being a student of Knights. It was like you had to listen to Boulding like a second or third or fourth time because he earned that right because he was a student of Knights in some sense. And so it was quite fascinating to see that as a young academic trying to figure out the sociology of how to fit in. And there you have it right there. It was amazing, actually.
Yeah, that's great context. You read it when you read about Boulding. Some academics you read about and you read about their personality and how they had clashes. They were clashing with people. Didn't get along. He seems to have gotten along with people and people from a variety of different backgrounds, fields. My own reading, which again is all secondary, is the only frustrations his colleagues had with him was because he constantly was taking leaves and teaching in these other departments. I guess he didn't do a lot in the department in terms of service and department meetings, the day-to-day kind of mundane operations, and that would frustrate people. But that aside, personally, it seems like he got along quite well with his colleagues inside and outside the various universities he was at. As we move to the conclusion here, I want to turn to a point you raised earlier. And so now I want to we've only briefly scratched the surface of his works, but I want to try to tie things together both with his own legacy, but also trying to be a little forward looking. And so in one of your responses, you talked about that he didn't have many dissertation students. And I actually don't know the number in my own readings. I didn't see much discussion of that, but I've shared this with you. Robert Halbriner in the Journal of Economic Issues wrote a review essay of Boulding's collected works when those came out. And he was very complimentary of Boulding. But in part of that review essay, he goes through a thought experiment of why, given Boulding's enormous body of work, his intellectual contributions, why no school of thought developed around him. And he contrasts Boulding with Milton Friedman, Paul Samuelson, and Joan Robinson. And and then Heilbronner kind of speculates, so he doesn't provide any evidence for this, but his view is that 2 things. Number 1, that Boulding kind of jumped around so much from topic to topic in many areas where people would not consider traditional economics, so that limited him in terms of his building a network. But then also that he was a relatively abstract thinker and writer, and that he didn't have, as you discussed earlier, he it wasn't that he was unfamiliar with the math, but he didn't have, like, very clean math models for X, Y, and Z. He didn't have clean tests, statistical type tests for, a clean set of propositions or hypotheses. And Heilbronner's speculation is that this abstract nature, compared with the pivoting from topic to topic, limited his reach. I don't know if you have any reactions to that, but I thought we could conclude by talking about number one, any other thoughts you have on the absence of we'll call it a Boulding school. But after that, and perhaps more importantly, I'm curious about thoughts you have on the possibility forward looking of a research program built around Boulding. So given the economics profession as it is today, there seems to me to be an opportunity for us to leverage Boulding's work as a stepping stone to do a whole set of different research projects and programs on a variety of topics precisely because that's what he did.
So I think that one way to so in that Halbrunner, review, he begins by quoting Boulding in his own introduction to the where Boulding describes himself as a voice in the wilderness. And so as a result, Halbrunner says that Boulding was a prophet that was honored but not heeded or something like that. And I think that that's right. But if you think about the main themes of Boulding's writings and ask yourself whether or not elite economists, so this goes back to the mainstream mainline thing, because remember that the mainstream is what's currently fashionable in the elite. And the point about the mainline and the schools of thought that I mentioned is that when the mainstream deviates from the mainline, schools of thought arise up to try to bring the mainstream back to the main line. That's their purpose. right? So when Armin Alchin is talking, it's not to be a voice in the wilderness, it's to correct the error that he sees at MIT, Harvard, Chicago, Stanford, and Princeton, right? So there's this error going on in the elite schools, and I need to fix it, right? I'm gonna, so they're working on Arohan the Brew model. I need to put the entrepreneur back into the model, and go there, right? They're dealing with an institutionally antiseptic world. I got to bring in law and economics again. So I'm Ronald Coase. I'm trying to fix the world. So the question I think that we have to ask ourselves, has the world moved more back towards Boulding, or has it moved farther away from Boulding as we got into the 21st century and going forward? And if you ask me, I think that there are such positive signs. Now, I don't agree that they've adopted completely. So, there's going to be problems with it. But if you look at like work by people like Darren Acemoglu, the most recent Nobel laureates, they're trying to bring in to the conversation questions that Boulding was already asking about. There's this great paper by Krugman where he tries to talk about Hirschman, and he talks about high theory and all these things like that, and why it is that Hirschman wasn't listened to in his time. Well, similar to Boulding, Hirschman was writing in a way that was not fashionable at that time. But those questions, as they relate to development economics, needed to be raised. And so you have down the road someone like Bill Easterly coming along, and so I'm not saying that these people have won the day, but they certainly have and they're not always recognized. And part of our job as intellectual historians, not necessarily maybe as economists, though I think those things are more tightly connected, but I could see, doing economics in a Boulding vein without even mentioning Boulding. Okay. I just don't think it's fair to Boulding. That's the that I have a very strong sense of, which is probably counterproductive, of intellectual justice, right? Because my heroes, I think, have been treated unfairly, and I want them to be treated fairly. Okay, but what really matters is the concepts, right? That Boulding was working with, the perspective that Boulding was trying to get. And I think that large part of what he's trying to get us to think about are the ways that people are trying to push 21st century economics to think about. And so I can imagine a future in which, again, if you think of that faithful choice, when Boulding wrote his article criticizing Samuelson in the beginning, not the after Samuelson who needs Smith, but the first one on the foundations of economic analysis, you can see an alternative economics that could have maybe developed and now is being captured in the work not only of Acemoglu maybe, but also clearly in the work of McCloskey and other kinds of people. Like McCloskey fits closer to Boulding's concerns than other economists from mid 20th century. So let me even put it in an extreme form. Boulding's style and concerns are more evident in McCloskey than Milton Friedman's style and concerns, right? And Friedman, of course, was a giant intellectually, but he also was an economist all the way through, as opposed to Boulding, who is a moral scientist. And so, is economics potentially have more evolutionary possibilities as a moral science, where philosophy and of course, I'm biased in this, right? The subtitle of our center that you and I run together, our program is what? Studies for advanced studies in philosophy, politics, and economics, right? So we see ourselves as is in that same reintroduction of the moral sciences, and that Boulding, in fact, would be one of the main moral philosophers in the age of economic scientism. And my view is that the future of our discipline will turn on how well we're able to articulate that non-scientistic version of our great discipline and political economy in its finest hours in that regard.
I love how you put that. And your comment on Acemoglu and his focus on a whole host of issues, civil society, institutional arrangements. Another example I think of this is Rajaram Rajan's work on the third pillar. So that the whole thesis of that book is that okay, you have markets in the state and economists who narrowly focus on those things and they forget this middle ground, whether it's civil society. What does that sound like? It sounds like Boulding on the integrative system.
Yeah, in Darren's most recent book, he's trying to remake liberalism, and is one of his arguments is that we need to pay attention to community.
Yeah, that's
And it's
right.
like, yeah, okay, there's been a bunch of people that paid attention to community for a long time. And again, it could be unproductive if you scold people, for like, why aren't you reading my great thinkers? But on the other hand, it could be very productive if you say, okay, now let's do this, take Boulding and use his concepts to try to make sense of the world today. Boulding, I think, is look, this is gonna sound crazy. I think economics, rightly understood, should win the Nobel Peace Prize because I think economics, rightly understood, is a story about how we have trading rather than rating, how it is that we develop social cooperation even in the most conflicted situations. Ultimately, it's about peaceableness. Anything that's peaceful is trading. That's what we mean by mutually beneficial voluntary exchange. And it's from soup to nuts, the whole thing in that regard. So to me, I think that we can take we can do it in a variety of ways, but one of the ways we could reach back to Kant and we could say, okay, what are Kant's two big ideas? One of them is strangers nowhere in the world. The other one is that we're going to have perpetual peace. And now the question is, how can we find that set of institutional patterns in human interactions that allow us to achieve both of those goals? And the way we work our way through that is through economic reasoning. But our goal is to have peace. And the goal of the liberal is to get peace. And then everything else, backward induction through that. And so our concern with property rights, our concern with open markets, our concern with the free mobility of labor and capital all relates to the issue of achieving peace. Right. And so to me, I think Boulding understood that in the most extreme way. And so as a result, he's even better than he didn't have the mental gymnastics that many of our other heroes have, which is I'm a liberal, but I need to be illiberal in this in order to sustain liberalism. And then what happens is they end up by being illiberal, right? To do that. And I think that Boulding is an example of how you can be liberal all the way through and therefore should be someone that we study and learn from tremendously.
That's a wonderful way to end. Thank you for talking through this with me, Pete. Just so listeners know, this is the introductory conversation in a series of podcasts we're going to be releasing about Boulding. And so subsequent podcasts will be a collection of authors who contributed first to the second issue of the journal Markets and Society, which is on the topic of peace with focus on both Bouldings. And then in the review of Austrian economics, we're finalizing a special issue around Boulding's thought, both backward looking, but more importantly, forward looking. And it will offer readers an opportunity to explore some of the ideas that you and I have talked about today and think about them in a more forward-looking way. And so those subsequent episodes will have short conversations with the authors of those papers. So, Pete, thank you so much as always for speaking with me.
I love talking to you, Chris, and I'm really hoping that some, the listeners of the show turn and do some sampling of Boulding as a result of the work that you're doing to highlight his ideas.
Yes, you and me both. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.